Hi, everybody. My name is Derek. I'm the CEO and founder of Wenwyn. Welcome to our channel. We are here to help you navigate the intersection of leadership and culture. And in this episode, we're going to talk about city influence and why it's important to recognize it and leverage it. Remember, no two cities on the planet are the same. That's important that we see cities as being individual and offering something unique and valuable to the world. Every place has equal worth. However, not every place is equally influential, and that's important to the leader, especially if you're going to love the city the way that God is asking you to love the city. Before we get going, let me encourage you to hit the subscribe button or check the like button if you like this video. We really do want to help you have practical insights into how to engage culture effectively, or at least give you the areas that you need to be thinking about, the perspectives and the tools that you might need to have in order to speak insightfully into culture. You can also check us out on wenwyn.com, and there we have some courses that'll help you and some other things that are going on that I think you'll want to be a part of. All right, let's talk about city influence. Now, one of my all-time favorite comedians is Steve Martin. And Steve Martin has a great master class, that's a shout out to masterclass.com, on how to do comedy, how to write comedy. He starts really in an interesting way. He says that he had zero talent whatsoever. Now, that's hard to imagine. Steve Martin has won nearly every comedy accolade under the sun. He's incredibly articulate. He's insightful as a comedy writer. He's insightful as a writer, period, and he's a great movie maker. So how does this guy go, I had absolutely no talent? And the answer is he really felt like he had to learn about comedy from the ground up. And as a part of his master class, he said, let me just deal up front with a question that I get asked all the time, which is, what should I do if I want to get into comedy? And his advice is pretty interesting. He says, you should move to a comedy town. Now, that sounds like it's pretty obvious advice. You should go to a city where there's a thriving comedy scene. New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, London, some places where they're known for having great comedy. But let's look a little deeper under the surface. Steve Martin is saying equally that, yeah, there are places you can laugh everywhere. Every place on the earth has the ability to generate comedy, but not every place is equally influential. So you should go to the place where there is a heightened emphasis on comedy, where you can surround yourself with people who understand comedy, and where you're at the epicenter of influence rather than being influenced down the line. There's something there about being at the forefront of time and timeliness in comedy. There's something there about being surrounded by the environment of it. Now, again, every place is equal, not every place is equally influential. Dr. Michael Porter from Harvard is a famous business strategist, and he talks about business clusters. I think Dr. Porter really put this on the map. Business clusters is the idea that there are certain places where certain businesses and industries thrive. The entertainment industry in Los Angeles. There are certain shipping hubs in the world. And around that cluster develop these other side industries that really circle around that main cluster. So for instance, Boston is an educational cluster and a medical cluster. And so there are businesses that cater to that cluster that then attract people, and that becomes a hub, that becomes a place of influence. It's important to know what makes your city influential and in which areas. And because no two cities are the same, they're going to receive influence differently, and they're going to give influence differently. There are some cities that are the recipients of another city's influence. And it's important as a leader to know where that's coming from and why. Now, yes, there are some cities that are globally influential, Milan or Paris for fashion, for instance. However, there's also an influence in your area on fashion. And so you have to be aware technologically, fashion, but more broadly speaking, culturally, in terms of values, where is our city either receiving influence or giving influence to others? What is the timeliness of that? Now, in case you think, well, that's just impossible to figure out, it's really not. In fact, often the cities themselves will tell you either their longing or what makes them great. And that's because cities compete against other cities and they have to figure out, okay, what does make us great besides the biggest ball of yarn or the greatest bottle of ketchup? There has to be something here that people can understand. Now, again, at Wenwyn, we think that that is best leveraged around city values. But cities themselves can give you a glimpse into their values. Years ago, I was doing some training on cultural engagement, and uh, there was a family that was moving to Europe, and they were moving to Bucharest. And they had to do a presentation on their city. And so they gave great historical background, they gave great religious background, they talked about kind of the struggle of that city. My question was, what's the longing of the city? What is it the city wants to establish itself as within the context of Europe? And it was a question that kind of stumped them. Now, unfortunately for the presenters, who were amazing folks and did great things in the city of Bucharest. But during that presentation, I had my laptop open and I was literally looking at the city site. And on the city website, they said, we want to be the future technological business cluster of all of Europe. And they actually had listed the companies that they had fostered to start and their locations. Now that's helpful to know. Years ago, I'm kind of a product of the Cold War. Some brief history. My mom is German. My dad was American. My mom's mom was one of two twin sisters that were separated by the wall in Europe, and so I'm very attuned to like Cold War dynamics and post Cold War dynamics. And it took me a little bit to adjust to a post Cold War world. And one of the ways, this is in the early aughts, I remember having to adjust was I was talking with someone once and they said, we want to go get great medical care. So we're going to Budapest. And I actually laughed out loud. I thought that was hilarious because in my little tiny brain, I just could not imagine Budapest being a great place to get medical care. I was thinking back in the Cold War days. Well, the truth is that since the Cold War, and it had been, a decade plus since the Cold War, Budapest had become this center for medical treatment. And it became it still is an incredible place for medical care and dental care, and just has this great cluster effect. And so once I did the research, I was like, oh, wait, that makes perfect sense. You should go to Budapest. That makes sense to me. So, knowing where your city is trying to be influential and why is important. Naperville, the city that I currently reside in, is the oldest city in DuPage County. It isn't trying to prove anything. It's never tried to prove anything. And yet, in the city history, other cities have tried to pick fights with Naperville. Most famously, Wheaton tried to pick a fight with Naperville. And Naperville has just kind of been like, no, we're here. We're not just the oldest, but we really feel like we know what we're doing. We don't view ourselves in competition with the other cities because we're just too busy leading and trying to be the city that revolves around these values. So that's important to know because if you come into Naperville thinking it has a chip on its shoulder, well, you're going to behave in a certain way to try to be an insider, and it's just not going to be helpful for you. So, knowing what makes a city influential is key to cultural insight. And cultural insight is key to influence. And every leader should seek to be an influence in the places that they live, work, and play, in the cities that they live in. In fact, I actually think that it's a God given mandate that we're to love the city. Now, we're not to love all the values of the city or everything in the city or everything the city does. In the same way, even when we look in the mirrors, we don't love everything about ourselves. And there should be certain things that we're ashamed of and don't like and want to change. But we are called to love the city because the city is not an abstraction. The city is a group of people that God came for and that God loves. And so we're to be a blessing to the city. So I know that that takes a little bit of work, but once you have the cultural insight, it actually allows you to know how to leverage that insight to be insightful and then to also be influential. depending on where you live. So, just some basic exercises. If you're a leader, very first thing you should do is you should look at either your city branding or your city history. It's pretty simple to do. Now, there are other slices and segments that you need to look at. We have those listed on our website. You can check those out. But I would begin there. Look at the history and look at the future. Then what you want to do is you want to look for the anomalies that are there, and you want to look at the things that stand out to you. Think in terms of city influence, either receiving that influence or giving that influence. Now ask yourself, what is driving that influence? What is it that we're known for? Would a comedian move here? To go with Steve Martin's advice. Um, would an educator want to be here? If so, at what level of education? Would a doctor want to live here? Is this a medical hub? Would a researcher want to be here? What about a creative? What about a painter? What about a musician? And start to really broaden out and be thinking, okay, what about a technician? What about a trucking industry? What about automotive industries? And start to think about the characteristics of that industry, and that'll help you begin to think about how to leverage that influentially.